November 8th, 1942, 2 a.m., off the coast of Morocco. Major General George Patton stood on the deck of the USS Augusta, watching the darkened shoreline through his binoculars. Behind him, the largest amphibious invasion force in American history pitched and rolled in heavy seas. 35,000 American troops were about to storm hostile beaches in a combined operation that would involve 3 separate landing forces across 500 miles of North African coast. This was it, America's first major offensive against the Axis powers. And almost nothing was going according to plan. The landing craft were scattered. The surf was running 8 feet high. Radio communications were failing. Units that were supposed to land together were miles apart. Intelligence about enemy positions was wrong. The French garrison that was supposed to be friendly was shooting at American troops. And the commander of the entire Western Task Force, George Patton, was learning in real time that there's a vast difference between training for war and fighting one. Operation Torch wasn't just America's entry into the ground war in Europe. It was a baptism by fire for an entire generation of American commanders who had spent their careers preparing for a war they had never actually fought. And if you think that sounds like a recipe for disaster, well, you're about to find out just how close to disaster the United States came in those first chaotic months of combat. Before we get into what went wrong and how they fixed it, hit that subscribe button, because we're diving deep into military history that doesn't get talked about enough, the messy, complicated, often embarrassing truth about how America learned to fight World War II. Let's go back 6 months before those landings. June 1942, the War Department in Washington. The United States had been at war for exactly 6 months since Pearl Harbor, and the American Army was facing a problem that couldn't be solved with money or industrial capacity. The problem was experience, or rather, the complete lack of it. The last time the American Army had fought a major war was 1918, 24 years earlier. An entire generation of officers had retired or died. The men now commanding divisions and corps had been junior officers in World War I, captains and majors. They had tactical experience at the company and battalion level, but none of them had ever commanded large formations in combat. None of them had coordinated combined arms operations. None of them had managed the logistics of moving and supplying tens of thousands of troops across hostile territory. They had studied it. They had trained for it. They had run exercises and war games, but they had never done it for real. And in war, there's no substitute for having done it for real. The British knew this. By 1942, the British Army had been fighting for 3 years. They had learned hard lessons in France, in Greece, in North Africa. They had commanders who understood how modern warfare actually worked, not how it worked in theory, but how it worked when the radios failed and the intelligence was wrong and the enemy did something unexpected. The Americans had none of that. What they had was enthusiasm, industrial capacity, and a lot of very confident young officers who were about to discover that war is nothing like the manual says it should be. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, understood the problem. He couldn't create experienced commanders out of thin air, but he could give them a chance to gain experience before the stakes got even higher. That's why he supported Operation Torch, even though the operation made almost no strategic sense. Think about it. The logical place to attack Germany was across the English Channel into France. That's where the decisive battle would be fought. That's where the Allied armies would ultimately have to go. North Africa was a sideshow. The British were already fighting there. The Germans had only a limited force under Rommel. Even if the Americans succeeded in North Africa, it wouldn't directly threaten Germany. It would tie up resources and troops far from the main theater. But Marshall and Eisenhower agreed to torch anyway, because the American army needed to learn how to fight, and North Africa was the one place where they could afford to make mistakes. The plan for Torch was ambitious. 3 separate landing forces would hit French North Africa simultaneously. The Western Task Force, under Patton, would land at Casablanca on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The Center Task Force would land at Oran in Algeria. The Eastern Task Force would land at Algiers, the capital. Together, they would secure French North Africa, trap Rommel's Africa Corps between the British 8th Army advancing from Egypt and the new American forces pushing east from Algeria. Then everyone would invade Sicily, then Italy, then eventually France. It looked good on paper. But Torch was being planned by an Allied command that had never executed an operation this complex, using American troops who had never been in combat, supported by a logistics system that had never been tested under fire. And to make matters worse, nobody really knew whose side the French were on. France had fallen to Germany in 1940. The government in Vichy collaborated with the Nazis. French forces in North Africa reported to Vichy, but the Americans hoped that maybe, just maybe, the French garrison wouldn't fight. Maybe they'd welcome the Americans as liberators. Maybe the whole thing could be pulled off without firing a shot. This optimism was about to run headfirst into reality. August 1942, London. Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower had just been appointed Supreme Commander Allied Forces for Operation Torch. It was his first combat command. He had never led troops in battle. He was a staff officer, brilliant at planning and coordination, but completely untested under fire. The British were nervous about putting an inexperienced American in overall command. The Americans insisted. This was going to be primarily an American operation. It needed an American commander. Eisenhower got the job. His first challenge wasn't the Germans. It wasn't even the French. It was his own officers. The planning meetings for Torch were a disaster. American and British officers disagreed on everything: landing sites, timing, objectives, command relationships. The Americans thought the British were overcautious and obsessed with past failures. The British thought the Americans were recklessly naive and didn't understand modern warfare. Both sides were right. The British wanted to land closer to Tunisia, to cut off Rommel more quickly. The Americans worried about getting too far inside the Mediterranean, where German air power could threaten the fleet. The British wanted night landings to avoid air attack. The Americans had never practiced night landings and thought it was too risky. The British wanted to wait for better weather. The Americans wanted to go before the Germans reinforced North Africa. Every decision became a negotiation. Every plan had compromises that made nobody happy. This was combined operations at its most frustrating. Different doctrines, different training, different assumptions about how war worked. Eisenhower spent as much time managing Allied politics as planning the invasion. He was learning something that wasn't in any manual. In coalition warfare, getting your allies to agree is harder than fighting the enemy. While the generals argued in London, the troops were training, and the training revealed some deeply concerning problems. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was supposed to lead the assault at Oran. They ran landing exercises in England. The exercises were a catastrophe. Landing craft got lost. Units landed in the wrong places. Communication between ships and shore broke down completely. Officers couldn't find their troops. Troops couldn't find their equipment. The exercise that was supposed to take 3 hours took 11, and that was in calm water with no one shooting at them. The officers running the exercise wrote up their after-action reports. The reports were ignored. There wasn't time to fix the problems. The invasion was scheduled for November. It was already September. They would have to learn on the job. October 1942, the invasion fleet began assembling. The Western Task Force, sailing from the United States directly to Morocco, was the largest amphibious force America had ever put to sea. Over 100 ships, 35,000 troops, thousands of vehicles. The logistics were staggering. Every ship had to be loaded in the correct sequence. Combat troops first, then their equipment, then supplies, then follow-on forces. If one ship loaded wrong, the entire operation could fail. The men doing the loading had never done this before. The officers supervising them had never done this before. They were making it up as they went. Some ships were loaded so badly that critical equipment ended up at the bottom of the hold, under tons of supplies that wouldn't be needed for weeks. The Center and Eastern Task Forces sailed from England. The convoy was massive, over 650 ships. It had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, then split up and hit 2 separate landing sites simultaneously. The convoy would be visible to German reconnaissance. Surprise was impossible. The whole operation depended on speed and confusion. Get ashore fast enough that the Germans couldn't react. Get enough combat power ashore that even if the French resisted, the Americans could overwhelm them. It was a race against time and German decision-making. November 7, 1942, one day before the landings. The invasion fleet was at sea, and Eisenhower was discovering that some problems can't be solved. The French situation was a mess. American diplomats had been negotiating with French officers in North Africa, trying to arrange a nonviolent takeover. The French were divided. Some wanted to fight the Germans. Some wanted to stay loyal to Vichy. Some wanted to wait and see who was winning before they picked a side. The Americans had been promised that General Henri Giroux, a French officer who had escaped from a German prison camp, would be smuggled into Algeria and would order the French forces not to resist. Giroux arrived in Gibraltar, met with Eisenhower, and immediately started making demands. He wanted to be supreme commander of all Allied forces in North Africa. He wanted the Americans to invade France, not North Africa. He wanted guarantees about French sovereignty. Eisenhower tried to explain that the invasion was happening in less than 24 hours. The ships were already at sea. Giroux couldn't change the plan now. Giroux refused to cooperate unless his demands were met. Eisenhower had planned his entire operation around French cooperation, and now his key French ally was refusing to help. There was nothing Eisenhower could do. The invasion was happening with or without French support. November 8, 1942, 1 a.m. off the coast of Morocco. The Western Task Force began lowering landing craft. The seas were rough, 8-foot swells. Men climbed down cargo nets in the dark, loaded with 60 pounds of equipment. Tried to time their jump into pitching landing craft. Men fell. Equipment was lost. Landing craft swamped. The plan called for the first wave to hit the beach at Fadala at 4 a.m. By 3:30, half the landing craft were still circling in the dark, trying to find their assigned positions. At 4 a.m., the first wave headed for shore. The beach defenses opened fire. The French were resisting. American troops waited ashore under machine gun fire. Many of them had never heard a shot fired in anger. Some froze. Some ran the wrong direction. Some did exactly what they'd been trained to do. But the training had never included 8-foot surf, darkness, scattered units, and live ammunition coming the other way. The troops that made it ashore found themselves in a confused fight with French colonial troops who were following orders from officers who were following orders from Vichy. Nobody wanted to be there. The French soldiers didn't want to fight Americans. The American soldiers didn't want to fight the French. But both sides had orders and men died. At Oran, the situation was worse. The plan called for 2 old American destroyers to ram their way into the harbor and land troops directly at the docks. The idea was to capture the port facilities before the French could destroy them. The destroyers, USS Walney and USS Heartland, charged into the harbor at 3 a.m. French coastal batteries opened fire at point-blank range. Both destroyers were torn apart. Over 300 American sailors died in less than 20 minutes. The port wasn't captured. The French demolished the facilities. The brilliant plan had resulted in a total disaster. At Algiers, the landing went better, but only because the local French commanders had secretly agreed not to fight. But even there, some French units resisted, and American troops found themselves in firefights in the city streets. They hadn't trained for urban combat. They didn't know the city. They took casualties from snipers they couldn't see. For 3 days, American forces fought French forces across North Africa. At Casablanca, French warships sorted from the harbor to attack the invasion fleet. American battleships sank them. French aircraft attacked American positions. American fighters shot them down. It was a pointless, tragic fight that nobody wanted but couldn't stop. Finally, on November 11th, the French agreed to a ceasefire. The cost? Over 500 American dead, over 1,000 wounded, thousands of French casualties. Ships sunk, aircraft destroyed, and the Americans hadn't even started fighting the Germans yet. But Eisenhower and his commanders had learned something crucial. They had learned they didn't know how to fight a war. The landing plan had been too complex. The intelligence had been wrong. The coordination between services had failed. The equipment didn't work as advertised. The troops weren't as well trained as everyone had thought. Radio communication, which was supposed to coordinate the entire operation, had broken down completely. Officers couldn't contact their headquarters. Headquarters couldn't contact the fleet. Units landed in the wrong places because nobody could tell them where they were. On land, American troops discovered that their tanks were inferior to German tanks. Their anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate German armor. Their radios had shorter range than German radios. Their tactics, learned in peacetime exercises, didn't work against an enemy that shot back. November 17, 1942, the first American troops made contact with German forces in Tunisia. The Wehrmacht had reacted faster than anyone expected. German transport aircraft were flying troops into Tunisia from Sicily. In a matter of days, the Germans established a defensive line that would hold for 6 months. The race to trap Rommel had failed. The Americans were about to learn what fighting the Wehrmacht really meant. The first engagement was at a place called Kasserine Pass. February 1943. The Germans attacked American positions with combined arms assault that shredded the inexperienced American forces. Panzers broke through American lines. German infantry, supported by artillery and air power, overran entire battalions. American troops retreated. Some units broke and ran. The Germans captured thousands of prisoners and massive amounts of equipment. It was a humiliating defeat. American newspapers called it a disaster. Congress demanded to know how American boys could be beaten so badly. The British, who had been skeptical about American fighting ability, had their doubts confirmed. But inside the American command, something important was happening. The generals were learning. Eisenhower relieved commanders who couldn't adapt. He promoted younger officers who showed they could fight. George Patton took over 2 corps and immediately instituted brutal training. He made his men wear helmets and uniforms properly. He enforced discipline. He court-martialed officers who failed. His men hated him. But when they went back into combat, they won. Omar Bradley took over from Patton and continued the process. He studied German tactics. He changed American doctrine. He coordinated with the British and learned from their experience. The American Army wasn't the same force that had landed at Casablanca 4 months earlier. They were harder, smarter, more realistic about what war actually required. By May 1943, the North African campaign was over. 250,000 Axis troops surrendered. The Americans and British controlled the entire southern Mediterranean. The next stop was Sicily, then Italy. But the real victory wasn't territorial. The real victory was that the American Army had learned how to fight. Before we wrap this up, if you found this deep dive into Operation Torch valuable, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you military history that goes beyond the sanitized textbook version. The real stories and mistakes, the lessons that shape how wars are actually fought. Don't miss the next one. The lessons from Torch weren't just tactical. They were strategic. Eisenhower learned how to manage coalition warfare. Marshall learned which generals could adapt and which couldn't. The American military learned that enthusiasm and industrial capacity weren't enough. You needed experience. You needed to understand that the enemy gets a vote. You needed to be flexible when plans fell apart. One of the American officers who fought in North Africa later wrote something that summed up the entire experience. He said the difference between training and combat is simple. In training, you're trying to do things right. In combat, you're trying to stay alive while nothing goes right. That's what the American Army learned in North Africa. When D-Day came in June 1944, the Americans landing on Omaha Beach weren't the same army that had landed in Morocco in 1942. They had better equipment. Sure. Better tactics. Absolutely. But more than that, they had something that couldn't be taught in any training exercise. They had experience. They had learned the hard lessons. They had figured out what worked and what didn't. They had commanders who had made mistakes and learned from them. That's what Operation Torch really was. It wasn't a strategic masterstroke. It was a very expensive education. Over 10,000 American casualties to learn lessons that probably should have been obvious. But those lessons couldn't be learned any other way. You can read about war. You can train for war. But you can't really understand war until you fought one. The generals who planned Torch made every mistake in the book. They overestimated their intelligence. They underestimated the enemy. They created plans that were too complex. They assumed technology would work perfectly. They thought training was the same as experience. They were wrong about almost everything. But here's the thing that saved them. They learned. When Patton's landing at Fadala turned into chaos, he didn't blame his troops. He fixed the training. When the destroyers got torn apart Oran, the Navy didn't try the same thing again. They changed tactics. When Kasserine Pass turned into a rout, Eisenhower didn't make excuses. He relieved the commanders who couldn't adapt and promoted the ones who could. The Wehrmacht in 1942 was the most experienced, most professional military force in the world. They had been fighting for 3 years. They had conquered most of Europe. Their officers had commanded in combat. Their tactics had been tested and refined. Their equipment was proven. They should have destroyed the inexperienced Americans. And for a while they did. But the Germans had a problem. They couldn't afford to learn. Every defeat was a disaster. Every loss was irreplaceable. They were fighting the whole world and couldn't make mistakes. The Americans could afford to learn. They had the industrial capacity to replace losses. They had the population to absorb casualties. They had the time to fix their mistakes. That's why Torch mattered. Not because it was a brilliant operation. It wasn't. Not because American forces performed well. They didn't. Torch mattered because it was a moment when the United States military stopped being a peacetime organization and became a fighting force. It was a moment when American commanders learned that war is chaos and the side that adapts to chaos wins. General Omar Bradley later said that if the United States had tried to invade France in 1942, the way some politicians wanted, it would have been a catastrophe. The American army wasn't ready. They needed North Africa. They needed Sicily. They needed Italy. They needed to learn how to fight before they faced the German army in France. He was right. The men who died at Fadala and Oran and Kasserine Pass paid the price for American inexperience. But their sacrifice bought something invaluable. It bought the experience that would win the war. By the time American forces landed in Normandy, they weren't amateurs anymore. They were veterans. They had fought in deserts and mountains. They had learned combined arms warfare. They had learned how to coordinate with allies. They had learned how to adapt when plans failed. They had learned how to win. That's the real story of Operation Torch, not the official history of a strategic operation that secured North Africa, but the unofficial story of how America learned to fight World War II, one mistake at a time, one lesson at a time, one battle at a time. And that's something worth remembering today, because the next time the United States goes to war, whenever that is, against whoever that is, the same lesson will apply. Training is an experience. Plans fall apart. The enemy doesn't cooperate. Technology fails. And the only way to learn how to fight a war is to fight one. Operation Torch was America's first time facing war without experience. It was messy. It was expensive. It was embarrassing at times. But it worked because the commanders who led it were willing to learn. And in war, the side that learns fastest usually wins. Thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Operation Torch. And I'll see you in the next one where we dive into more history they don't teach you in school.